Hey, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to True Crime Wednesday. Boy, do we have a lot to talk about. I think we're going to spend a fair amount of time focusing on the Murdoch case because all of you folks who've been watching it know that they finally got to closing arguments today, and the prosecution gave their closing arguments. The defense will start tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern Time, and it is going to be very interesting. So hope y'all can hear me. And I was just checking my microphone here. So I think we're going to have a really interesting time talking tonight, mostly about Murdoch. There've been a couple of minor developments in the Vallow Daybell case, so I'll bring you up to speed on those first. As you all know, I like to chat a little bit, and then while everybody is sort of joining us, and then we'll get caught up on Murdoch. One of the things I'd love to do tonight, I'm not going to talk as much as I usually do because tonight I'd like to hear what you have to say about whether you think he's guilty or innocent in the Murdoch case. So we're going to open it up for those questions and comments in a short minute. So before we do that, please, if you have the opportunity, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Please like this video because it definitely helps us with the algorithm. And also, please hit that notification bell because we're getting closer and closer to the Vallow case. And we're going to be doing a lot of quick little short videos, YouTube shorts, and all those things once the trial starts. So, I do want to talk just briefly about what's going on in the Vallow case. As most of you might remember, there is some DNA that they claim is newly discovered DNA, probably is newly discovered DNA. As they were doing the analysis on some of the duct tape, they discovered a couple of new hairs. They're tiny, so they must be body hairs. It's common for those kind of things to be picked up in duct tape because it's sticky. And so the state disclosed that those new hairs had been found. And when the state lab said that they didn't believe they were going to be able to test them, one, because of timing, and two, because they don't necessarily have the most sophisticated technology, the state went out, prosecution went out, and found a specialty lab to complete that testing. We know that it's going to also be consumptive testing because those samples are very small. So we definitely want, and of course, John Pryor wants to know whether or not that DNA might be exculpatory. The chances are that it's not, but there's always, even if there's a tiny chance that that might be exculpatory, the defense is entitled to have it. So now we're in this ticking down in the final hours of getting ready for trial, and we have this unknown amount of DNA. The last thing we heard was last Thursday night after the pretrial conference, the last hearing that they had. We heard that the state had provided the defense with that information, but when the court set a hearing, Mr. Pryor came in and said he hadn't had time yet to really review the report and fully understand it. So the court set out until tomorrow another hearing on the matter. So I'm hoping by the time we do our Friday show, we should know a little bit more about what the court's going to do about this rogue DNA. The issue is that that John Pryor keeps saying he needs extra time to have his DNA specialist analyze the raw data. Now, we know that they don't have enough of a sample to retest, but we do know that his DNA specialist should probably be able to review not just the findings, but all of the raw data. So what we don't know is whether or not the judge is going to sever these cases. Now, the judge has sort of telegraphed that if this consumptive DNA and if the state not getting the DNA to prior in a timely manner is an issue, that the judge would consider severing the trial because Lori Vallow's trial must happen because of the speedy trial issue. She's already beyond the speedy trial limit. So I'm hoping by Friday we're going to know something about that. But right now it's all really up in the air. So for those of you who have been covering the Murdoch trial, I just saw a super chat come up, and I want to mention before we get too deep into things, thank you, Debbie, for your super chat donation. Thank you also, Susie. Sorry, I have to get too close to read those things. Thanks so much for those. I just want to remind everybody that all of those super chat donations go directly to our moderators because I couldn't do this without their help. So for Brenda and Michelle, if you appreciate what great mods they are, please feel free to drop them a super chat. And thank you for all those who have so generously donated to them. Back to Murdoch. So we know that the Murdoch trial has been going on for almost 4 weeks now. No, I'm sorry, almost 6 weeks now. And at this point, the prosecution and defense have both rested. This morning, at the request of the defense, the jury took a ride out to Moselle and went for a jury view of the scene. You know, I don't think jury views ever hurt a case because I think that it's sometimes very difficult from photographs for the jury to be able to understand the spatial layout of things. No matter how you show them diagrams and animations and all of those things, it's still the easiest is to be able to go there and physically be in the space. Now, I guarantee you it is also difficult to do that. It is difficult because you have people going to this spot where they know something horrendous has happened and standing in that space. It is eerie, it is difficult. It's so it's kind of a double-edged sword whether you really want to put the jurors through that or not. But I think it is helpful because it was helpful for them to be able to see that perhaps the distances that they were picturing were smaller than they had envisioned. And I think that I think that Creighton Waters has said all along, it's hard to get a spatial understanding of how of the physical space. I think they will be surprised that the space is much closer in proximity than they expected it to be. So they went out this morning and saw the Moselle property, and then they came back to court. Creighton Waters started his closing before lunch, and then he continued after lunch, and they wrapped up with Creighton's testimony today. The judge was, at one point, Dick Harpootlian, Murdoch's lawyer, got up and expressed some concern about the timing, and the judge assured him that he would get to make his closing arguments when the jury was fresh and not at the end of the day, because I think Dick Harpootlian was a little concerned about that. And I think that that is fair and reasonable. So remember, in a criminal case, the prosecution goes first, they give their closing and their summation, and then the defense gives theirs, and then the prosecution gets a rebuttal opportunity. The reason for that is because they have the burden of proof. So I think it is, I will say I listened to all of Creighton's closing. I thought that he was very much, as he's been throughout this trial, pretty methodical and pretty pointed. But I thought there were times that his closing lagged a bit. And closing is the time for you to really bring home the story for the jurors. I once had a trial instructor, a person who taught trial practice, say the very most important thing you can understand is that people, jurors, people in general, want a story. When you're telling somebody something, they're looking for a story, a beginning, a middle, an end, a moral, the peaks and the valleys of a story. And so the more you can make your closing in particular more like you're telling them a story, the better. Certainly it's good in opening as well to be able to tell people a story based on what you think the evidence is going to show, based on giving them a roadmap for what they're going to hear. But closing argument is about knitting all those disparate pieces together. So I think Creighton did a pretty good job of outlining all of the pieces and how they fit together, because that is the purpose of closing. But it's also the purpose of closing to tell that story in the way that a fiction story peaks and wanes. So it's important to bring the story through those emotional peaks. Now, I think Creighton did that in some regard, but I think he got a little bogged down, and I think there were times that he may have lost the jury. And closing's not the time that you want to lose the jury. Closing is the time that you want the jury sitting forward and riveted on their seat. So it's important to get the information across, but it's also important to do it in a way that is gripping. And so I think there were times that Creighton, when he was actually describing the murder and what he says Alec did, I think he did a really good job of using really active voice and active words and trying to really grip the jury. But I think there were times that he got a little bit in the weeds with some of the technical stuff that he could have made it more interesting. I thought it was interesting that when he talks about that period after the murders, when Elliot goes back to the house, or the period after the murders before he leaves for Moselle, and everyone assumes he goes back to the house. He's talking about those like 268 steps that he takes in that very short period of time. What is he doing? And I think he did a really good job at that. He made people think, well, what was he doing? And I think that he could have made more of those. It could have made more of those technical points more active, the way he did when he talked about those steps. So, but in general, I think he did a really great job. I think he has done a really workmanlike, competent job throughout this entire trial. I will tell you that there was one thing that I was disappointed about. And this is just, I don't know, maybe it's just personal. I don't know. There are limits on what you can do in closing and what you can do in rebuttal arguments. And so since I don't know South Carolina law, I don't know whether this was something that he just couldn't do. But he brought up this concept of Alec being a family annihilator. Now, this is a term of art. Family annihilator is a social science and psychological term. And for those of you who have read this week's newsletter, you'll see that I talk about what it means to be a family annihilator. But there is a very specific pattern, a very specific personality definition of what it means to be a family annihilator, and some very definite, like, red flags that come along with being a family annihilator. And had I been doing this case, I think that getting him up on the stand, this is the point. I wondered why Creighton Waters would say to him when he had Alec on the stand, "Are you a family annihilator?" And Alec, of course, jumped to, "No, if you mean, did I kill my wife and son? I didn't." Okay. But that would have been the perfect time for him to then, on rebuttal, bring in, even for a brief 20-minute witness who is an expert on family annihilators, and would have said, "Now, Mr. Murdoch says he's not a family annihilator, doctor. What is a family annihilator? And what about the facts of this case?" Now, understanding that this is not a person who has done any kind of evaluation individually on Alec, and he would have to make that very clear. But to say, what is it about the facts of this case that would lead you to believe that Mr. Murdoch is or could be a family annihilator? And really drive home what it means to be a family annihilator. Otherwise, why ask that question? Why introduce that term unless that was going to be the pivot point of your closing? And I didn't think Creighton did that. I think it's always important that you have that pivot point, that touchstone in an opening and a closing. So Creighton did a great job in his opening about showing his phone. There's my daughter, showing his, brandishing his phone and talking about that phone evidence was going to be critical, because it was. I mean, had I been doing the closing, one of the things I would have said was, the little detective solved this even after his death. He solved it from his grave. Because had it not been for that kennel video, we would never have known that Alec was really there. And we would have never caught him in yet another of his lies. So I would have gone there, and I certainly would have gone to the family annihilator. I would have made that a much bigger point, because otherwise, why bring it up? I mean, I didn't think that. I thought it was, the whole concept is really powerful. So I thought it was kind of a missed opportunity for him to bring it up and then be like, "Oh yeah, he was a family annihilator." What does that mean? Because as you can see from this week's newsletter, it has a very specific meaning, that it has a very, that there is a definition of characteristics of a family annihilator. So this also leads me, before we open this up to questions, and I'm kind of giving my mods a little bit of a heads up that we're gonna start taking some questions. And I before even questions, I really want to hear from you, your impressions of the case, whether you think Murdoch's guilty, whether you think that the jury will find him guilty, and what you think of both attorneys and how they've performed. So while the mods are racking those things up, there are a couple things that I do want to remind you of. For those of you who don't subscribe to my newsletter, it is free. We don't sell your data. We don't give away your email address. And I use the newsletter to sort of take deep dives into things like what's a family annihilator? Or like, let's talk about Rule 403B evidence and whether or not it can come in to prove character. Those sort of things, if you are interested in getting on your ghillie suit and getting down in the weeds with me, you need to be subscribed to the newsletter. So let's hear what you have to say. Hi, Debbie Hersko. Thanks again for your super chat. Debbie says, I believe Alex mixes some truth with lies, and I think he told his why he murdered Maggie and Paul. Paranoid. He was paranoid that the little detective and Maggie were plotting to take him down. I think that's very much part of it. I think that Maggie had become very suspicious, and I think that that clearly Paul was trying to keep him from using drugs. The other thing that I recall him saying was that he had made a promise to Paul that when the boat crash issue was all done, he would go to rehab. There is nothing more desperate than an addict who is trying to stay addicted. And so I think that was a real threat to him. The very idea that Paul was going to hold him to that and make him go to rehab. Who else has it? Sherry Long. This is an excellent point. Sherry says, I was so relieved when Waters included the fact that the dogs did not hear anyone there. I felt that this was a key point considering how important hunting dogs are to the Murdoch lifestyle. I agree completely. These were dogs that were trained for hunting, and certainly were dogs that would alert if something were amiss. And as you see on the kennel video, they're all running around. You know, you hear on the kennel video, Bubba's out killing chickens. So they're all out running around. So somebody put them up in their kennels after the murders. Somebody put them up, and somebody and it had to be somebody they knew. There was never any indication that the dogs were reacting to somebody they didn't know. So great point. And I was glad that Creighton raised it as well. Linda Venorio, he's guilty, but I'm afraid they may be hung. Paul and Maggie were on to him. Yeah, I think so. But I can certainly see the possibility that there may be a hung jury. I think it's important to remember that this is a jury from this local area, that they all know the Murdochs, that they are very influential people. They're not the only influential people in the area, but a lot of the other people who came and testified in the trial are equally influential people. So I think it's possible it could be a hung jury. I certainly don't think Creighton Waters is out of the woods when it comes to hanging the jury. So good point. Thanks. Hi, T Diva. I was glad that Waters brought up that Alex said he thought whoever planned the murders thought about it for a while. That was Alex telling on himself. Oh, I agree completely. There were many times when Alec told on himself. I think one of the significant ones was when he talked about how he had hurt so many of the people he loved. I thought that was a very clear telegraph that he has hurt many people he loved. And when push came to shove, he hurt the people he loved the most. He took their lives. Susie Gay, if there is a hung jury, do you think they will wait for the financial crime verdicts before deciding if they retry the case? This is a good question, and I would expect that they would, only because they're probably a little farther down the road getting the financial crimes resolved. But remember, Alec made all those admissions to the financial crimes. So I think I don't believe he would have gotten on the stand and made admissions to all those financial crimes, because this is the first time he has really made a confession of what he did. I don't think he would have done that if he hadn't anticipated that he was going to plead out to those financial crimes. So I expect those are going to get resolved pretty quickly, regardless of what happens in this case. But it would make some sense to make sure that to make those the priority before deciding to retry the case, because, ultimately he may get a life sentence out of those as well. T Diva, I don't think Judge Newman will allow a hung jury. Well, sometimes it's beyond the anything the judge can do. I'm not sure that I think that Judge Newman has set the tone with the jury right away. It was interesting because in Judge Newman's court, he always chooses the jury foreman. And the jury pushed back and said, but we already chose somebody. And Judge Newman said, nope, that's not the way I operate my courtroom. And so this person will be the jury foreperson. So I think he sort of set the tone with them that he would be giving them guidance and helping make decisions with them. So I don't know, because if you have a holdout juror who just says, you're not going to change my mind, there's very little the judge can do. If a jury comes back and says we're deadlocked, and the judge can say, go back and deliberate some more, go back and look at more evidence, go back and review the evidence again, go back and deliberate again, and hope that going back and reviewing the evidence again, talking it through again, that they will reach some sort of a consensus. But I mean, as much as I like Judge Newman, and I think that he has been rock solid in this case, he's like the best judge ever. There is a point that he won't be able to do anything about a hung jury. But I'm sure he will do some arm twisting if they come back and say they're deadlocked. I'm sure he will come back and say, get your butt back in the jury room, go back and review evidence, go back and review testimony, and come back when you have a verdict. So it's just not always that easy. MJ, I don't feel that Waters brought everything together in his closing. Personally, I think he probably did it, but the defense did not convince me beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm assuming you mean the prosecution. I agree that we've talked about this before. A circumstantial case is a chain, right? And that's the way I always think of it, is it's links in a chain. You have to be able to link up every one of those links, because everywhere there's a disconnect, that's reasonable doubt. So you have to be able to think of that evidentiary chain and consciously connect it. And I agree that there were some places where perhaps the prosecution's connection for those links either wasn't there or was kind of tenuous. So I think for me personally, the most convincing thing is the kennel video and the fact that he lied about it. To me, that shows true consciousness of guilt. And so in my mind, he showed up on the golf cart. He had both guns with him. There's some discussion about, most of the experts have said they think Paul was shot first. To me, it makes more sense if he's on the golf cart and he wheels up and Maggie's out there and he shoots her first. But either way, I think he comes up on the golf cart, he shoots them, he realizes he's covered in blood and etc. And so he then pulls the hose down, washes himself off in front of the kennels, probably strips, washes himself, goes back to the house, changes his clothes, and then takes the guns and the bloody clothes puts them in some sort of a container and takes them to Alameda. It's clear that he parks out towards the outbuildings. There's lots of steps around before he finally goes in the house. So he's secreting the evidence someplace. Neither one of his parents are well enough to be out looking around in all those outbuildings. And he then spends his time at Alameda, goes back. He already knows what he's expecting, so it takes him no time at all to call 911 from the time he arrives. And then, of course, we have all the 911 and all the body camera footage. So I think that I don't think that it is at all unusual that someone could be hysterical and upset about what they'd seen, even if they did it. I think that is more common than not, probably. So, but I agree that I think there are a few little holes in the prosecution's case, and I'm certain that the defense is going to be driving a truck through those holes in tomorrow's closing arguments. Hi, Janet. Question. I heard a rumor that the email that Judge Newman received was about a juror. Do I have any insight? I do not. I've heard the same rumor. If it was a juror talking to other jurors, that could be a problem. Now, this happened yesterday. So remember, it happened yesterday. The judge called the attorneys into chambers, and we really didn't get any further information about it. We know there's still a couple of alternate jurors remaining. They will stay on until the verdict is reached. So even though they are not deliberating, they are not involved in the discussion of the jury, they will be in the jury room while the deliberations are going on. So I don't really know. It seems to me that if there were some juror misconduct, real juror misconduct, Judge Newman would have to excuse that juror and replace that juror with an alternate. He may not have said why, but he likely would have done it. We've seen him go through 4 or 5 alternate jurors already. So we've seen him do that. If in fact the juror was talking to other jurors, then we have a bigger problem that could cause a mistrial. But neither one of the lawyers, neither side came out and made a motion for a mistrial, which tells me that whatever it was that happened was not mistrialable. I mean, that it didn't rise to the level being serious enough to cause a mistrial. And because we didn't see a juror being excused, I'd say it didn't rise to the level of a juror being disqualified. So I don't have any information. I hope that's something that we'll get information about once the trial is over and we get a verdict. So, I mean, I think Judge Newman has made comments several times about the fact that we really, the longer the trial goes on, the harder it is to keep a jury long term. And so I think that may be part of it. Polly Olson, redoing my question. Why is Alex's attorney, Pooley, so angry? Ever since Alec testified, he's upset about being there. That could be a variety of reasons. We're talking about Dick Harpootlian, who really came out angry and swinging a day or so ago. He came out very angry and swinging in some objections and also in some cross-examination. It's tough. First thing I will say is trial is exhausting. It's exhausting for the lawyers, for the judge, for the jury. It is an exhausting experience. And when you are a lawyer and you are sitting at counsel table, particularly in the defense posture, you have this client next to you whose life is really relying on your work. You're trying to keep track of objections. I mean, it's like the ultimate in multitasking, because this part of your brain has got to be listening to the trial. This part of the brain has got to be keeping track of your client and his behavior and his reactions, and taking notes, and trying to keep at least some part of your brain open for what's coming up for you, and trying to raise appropriate objections at the time. And it is really a difficult juggling act. This is the reason why in these complex cases, there's usually more than one lawyer at the counsel table, because dividing and conquering those duties is easier when you have a really complex case. But it's exhausting. And so I could see, and Dick Harpootlian is not a young guy, so I could see him just being absolutely wrung out and emotionally, mentally beat. Because remember, every day when the trial is over, this trial team is going back to wherever they're staying. In Harpootlian's case, it's a $20,000 a week fancy wedding venue. But nonetheless, they're all going back. They're getting something to eat, and they are sitting down and working until they go to bed for the next day. This is one of the reasons why so many people were amazed that the OJ trial took as long as it did, because that defense, those trial teams were literally doing that and then working all weekend, and they were doing that for months. And that is absolutely soul stealing. So I could understand that Dick Harpootlian's not a young guy, and he might possibly just be getting tired and cranky. I also think it's possible that he's very frustrated with the direction the case has taken. It would not surprise me to learn that Alec Murdoch did not tell his own attorneys that he had been down to the kennel that night until the day before he testified to it. I would not be surprised to hear that at all. I would not be surprised to hear that they had been completely taken blindsided. And that would make any lawyer mad. You absolutely cannot prepare for what you don't know. And if your client is not being completely honest with you, you're going to go down the wrong road. So I could see both issues being some of the reasons why he is so angry. Yes, you called him Pooley. I always refer to him as Pooty, but he's an interesting character. He's also a lawyer who doesn't like to lose, and I think he sees his cases potentially going down in flames. Good question, Polly. Gail Swift Fernandez. Hi, Gail. Court TV announced before the trial today a juror emailed a coworker that she thought he's innocent. Okay, well, Court TV may know that. I don't. But as long as this juror is willing to go through deliberations and actually review the case, I don't think there's any harm in that, as long as it has not spread out into the larger jury pool. So it certainly is inappropriate, and by this time in her trial, she should have known better. But apparently, it has not impacted the trial. Gritty Gret. Question. Any thoughts on the staging of the property? Buster's flower pot, Maggie's bike, etc. I had not heard about anybody staging the property, but I wouldn't be surprised if John Marvin was out there and kind of prettied it up before they came. So it wouldn't surprise me. Um, and who knows when that happened. Um, I think John Marvin's been out there taking care of that property, and yeah, wouldn't surprise me. Wanting to put the best face on things. Um, does it impact the jury's impression of the property? Probably not. I mean, I think they would expect to see personal belongings that belong to the victims. I think it's probably more sobering to just know you're standing in the spot where someone died. Retired RN 43, howdy. Question is this isn't a question, but I think I heard a comment from someone during the trial that led me to believe that Alex did not tell his attorneys about being at the kennels. Yeah, I don't know for sure. And I'm not sure they have really said. It certainly wouldn't be something that I would say in court. I might say it in chambers, but it certainly is not anything that I would reveal in court. If my client had just sandbagged me, I would not be revealing that to a jury. So it would surprise me if that comment was made, but it's possible because I think Pootie's pretty pissed about it. And rightly so, I guess. If Alec is paying all of this money, and you've got to know that if they're paying $20,000 a week for the place they're staying at, I guarantee you that their fees are in the millions. If you're paying all that money to your lawyer, it doesn't behoove you to lie to your lawyer. There's no way a lawyer can be prepared for what they don't know. So, yeah, it's possible. Gail again. I feel Maggie was done with Alex. He had done previous detoxing at home and she was there through these ordeals. That he was back using again and she was ready to have him move on. I think that's possible, but I want to remind you that they had been married a long time, and Maggie's whole identity of who she was, her whole lifestyle, the way that she lived her life was dependent on Alec making lots of money. So I wouldn't be so quick to jump to the conclusion that Maggie was ready to dump Alec. But I do think she was suspicious about the financial matters. She was concerned about his continuing use. Creighton Waters pointed that out and talking about the texts that went back and forth during the baseball games prior to the murders that weekend. And I think that probably she was suspicious, concerned, worried. She was very worried about the boat crash and what it was going to cost them and where that money was going to come from. And I think she was very suspicious about Alec's ongoing financial machinations. So while I'm not sure that she was ready to give him the heave ho, I think she certainly was ready to get an explanation. Hi, Bo Peep. Do you think it's odd that John Marvin said he was the first one there and the last to leave that night and admitted that he hosed Paul's body off before the police arrived? So he did not admit that he hosed Paul's body off before the police arrived. He was the first of the family on the scene. He arrived, my understanding is he doesn't live very far away. He sort of lives, if I have the diagram right in my head, he and Alec kind of live in a triangle with Almeda. And so he didn't live that far away. So it was kind of made sense for him to be the first family member there. Buster was coming from Columbia, I think. Randy said he lived about an hour or more away. So it would make sense that John Marvin would be the first person on the scene. What John Marvin testified to was he was there, and this would make sense. If your brother had just been through this horrendous experience and your nephew that you were very close to was dead, it would make sense that you would be with your brother and you would stay. So it doesn't surprise me that he was the first one there and that he was the last to leave. He actually made sure that Alec and Buster's girlfriend all got to Alameda, where they stayed at their mother's home that night. But what John Marvin said was, after the bodies had been removed, he went down not wanting anyone else to have to go and see that horrendous scene. He went back down and hosed down the feed room. That was after the police had been there, after all the photos had been taken, after everything was done and the bodies had been removed. It's hard to understand what people do in the midst of grief. And I have to give John Marvin some grace for that, because he was close to Paul. Paul worked for him. He was especially close to Paul of all his nieces and nephews. And so you got to give him a little grace too. What he saw was he didn't want anyone else to have to experience that. And he felt it was disrespectful to Paul for his blood to be on the floor. I don't know that was all that unusual. It strikes me that John Marvin has always been the family patriarch. I mean, he's always been sort of the next in line. He's the family fixer, the one that the family goes to when they have a problem. He, and of course, their father Randolph. But Randolph's been ill for a while, and I think that John Marvin has sort of stepped into that vacuum. So I don't think that it's all that surprising. But I do want to correct that misapprehension that he hosed Paul's body off. He did not. He hosed down the area where Paul's body was after it had been removed. And I think there was some thinking in his mind that he didn't want Alec or Buster to have to worry about that. Not really understanding that there probably are services that can come, and take care of those things. I think that he was thinking, I just don't want them to have to confront that. And, it's like one more example of John Marvin being the family, not fixer, but being the person who everybody looks to, and him sort of stepping into taking that role. So good question though, Bo Peep. Lee here. Oh, please. She knew about the money for sure. Knew they had no insurance, and both she and Alex tired of covering and paying for the kid. Plus, it wasn't the drugs that cost so much, it was gambling. Well, I think gambling is possible, but I don't know that there's ever been any real any confirmation that there was gambling. We know that Buster went to Vegas with John Marvin at one point, but I don't know that there's ever been any real clear picture of any clear evidence that he had a gambling problem. Although addiction is addiction, and oftentimes people have more than one addiction. So, I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibility. We don't know where all that money went. I would be shocked to find out that it all went to drugs, or that it all went to Cousin Eddie, or there was some sort of drug running cartel thing going on. I suspect it's somewhere offshore. I think he still got some of it. So that'll be interesting to see as things calm down and they're able to sort of cull through a lot of those other instances. I'm not convinced that Maggie knew the extent to which Alec was his money issues. I think they had a very traditional relationship where he called the shots, he managed the money, she got her allowance, and she could buy her designer clothes, and that was their division. I think it was a very traditional relationship, and I would not. I don't believe Maggie knew what he was doing. What happens if a hung jury? Hi, Dee Dee. I do want to say on the issue, and I will get to Dee Dee's question here in just a second, on the issue of insurance. There has been a lot of discussion about him having insurance, but I don't know that it's ever even been proven that he had his life insured. So I think that's an up in the air question. I don't think it's unusual for people who are pretty wealthy not to have life insurance. It's more typical than you would think. What happens if there's a hung jury? Well, then it will be up to the prosecutor to decide whether or not to retry the case. The prosecutor could decide that too much time has gone on, or that some critical witness has disappeared, or a number of other things could happen, and they could decide not to retry the case. I absolutely I would be shocked if they decided not to try the case again. So my expectation would be that if there's a hung jury, they will retry the case. And in some ways, they get a second bite at the apple. They get a chance to tighten up what might have been, what might have been a little bit loose in the circumstantial evidence chain, and it's not always a horrible thing for the prosecution. So, but it does mean that all those witnesses have to go through all that again, and the family has to go through it again. I know that is always a concern of the prosecution, putting the family through a second trial. In this case, I don't know that they're that worried about the feelings of the family. Cam Stokes, do I think there's enough evidence to convict him? I believe that there is enough evidence to convict him. Taken all together, which is what you have to do in a circumstantial case, taking everything together and being able to say this and then this and then this. So, all of the little pieces together. The fact that he didn't take his phone to the kennel video that shows that he was there. And then you put on top of that the cell phone data that shows that Paul took the kennel video and Alec was there 5 minutes. And within another 5 minutes, their phones lock forever and don't come on again. The kennel video gets taken, but it never gets sent to Rogan. So something interrupted him sending that video, because he had been having a pretty back and forth conversation with Rogan about the dog and the dog's tail and whether the dog was injured, and send me a picture, send me a video if you can't get the video. So there had been a replies back and forth, and that was a conversation that was going on with Rogan, and then it suddenly stopped, and the video that Paul took didn't get on to Rogan, which tells me that it got interrupted. That conversation got interrupted. And so I think all of that taken together, I think points beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the crime. The guns were family guns. There's no indication that there was anybody else around. There was no indication that the dogs alerted. There was no indication that some bad guy came along and murdered his family while he was up at the house changing his shirt to go to Mama's. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense any other way. So That would be the way I would think through it. But reasonable minds can differ, and juries can look at it and say, here's this hole that I can't wrap my brain around, and for me that's reasonable doubt. So, jury trials are not 100%. Reasonable doubt is 98%. And something that's more beyond that, then I think you're more likely looking at a hung jury. Jam. Question. I'm assuming this means if they get a hung jury. If they retry the case, could the defense avoid allowing the financial crimes being let in? Or since they were in the first case, would they be allowed? Well, I think that would depend on the judge. If it's Judge Newman, we know that he's already done that analysis and decided that information came in to prove motive. Now, if it's not Judge Newman, a different judge could come to a different conclusion with the same case law and the same information. So it's possible a different judge could say, no, I'm not going to let those financial crimes in. The bigger issue at this point is if they wait to decide whether or not they're going to retry the case and wait to see what happens with the financial crimes. If he pleads out to the financial crimes, I don't see if there's any way that he can't, that he's been on the stand and admitted them all. So I don't see that there's any way that he could go to trial now. They're just going to bring in his sworn confessions and convict him. So it doesn't seem to me likely at this point that he's going to go to trial on the financial crimes. So if he pleads those out, now he's given up his Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination. And so all of that could come in. And the fact that there are convictions rather than I got to back up a minute. Under the rules of evidence, convictions of crimes of dishonesty come in. And they're an exception to that. You can't bring in character evidence stuff. So the convictions for the financial crimes would come in. Because what the prosecution will say is he's a convicted liar. He lied about all these things. He's a convicted thief. He lied about all of these things. And it would come in that way. So, I mean, they boxed themselves into a corner by having him admit to all those financial crimes. Definitely. I mean, if they thought they were doing that to try and make him look like a repentant guy, I think they made a mistake. Hailey here. Repeat question. If there's a hung jury, will he get out on bail? Unlikely. I think that the prosecution would ask that that the bail that he's currently under, that he continue to be held on, and that was he couldn't post enough to get out. So bail was set. It's just a matter of whether or not he could post enough to get out. And if he's got to turn around and pay his lawyers to try this case for a second time, yeah, there's no way he's going to be able to post bail. Question. Hi, Hazelnut. Not really a legal question, but why do you think that Paul and Maggie have no headstones a year and a half after their deaths? All this money and just plastic placards. I hadn't heard that, and I don't know. That's very sad. Potentially part of it is because Alec's been in prison or in jail and hasn't really had the opportunity to do that. But it does surprise me that Maggie's family have not insisted that there be some sort of a memorial to them. So that's very sad. I'm sorry to hear that. I think it's unfortunate too, because John Marvin is her executor of her estate. So I think it's sad that John Marvin hasn't taken that into consideration. KCL, the kennel video. Alec's own words that he was down there. I'm lying. 19 seconds to check bodies and GPS data equals most damning. Yeah, I can't disagree. I think that when you look at the timeline, there's another thing I wanted to point out in my newsletter this week, which you can get in the archives on the website. If you don't get it, you can hop into the archives and read it there. In that newsletter is a link to a woman who has done a remarkable timeline. And she has taken every bit of that electronic evidence, the steps, the calls, and put it into the times that the car went in and out of park, the GPS data, all of that, has put it all into this amazing timeline. And so if you get a chance, I will add the link to that timeline to our show notes tonight. But if you get the chance, follow her on Twitter and take a look at that timeline because it's incredible. And I really think that when you look at the overall timeline, the number of steps everybody took, there's just no way that it could be anything else. You know, you couldn't have the phantom vigilantes show up, nobody know it, leave no evidence, and be gone in the time that it took him to leave the scene after the kennel video. So I have to agree, KCL. I think it's hard to envision it working out any other way. So we're right on the hour. I'm going to take 2 more questions or 2 more comments, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. And we'll reconvene on Friday to go over stuff for Vallow Daybell. Claire, question: would he be eligible for a public defender if there is a second trial? This is an interesting question. I don't believe so, because I believe that he's still part owner of the Edisto Beach House. Now, I know that is likely has liens on it and will be seized to pay the judgment in the beach case, in the boat case. But I think he still owns property. Now, my understanding is Moselle was entirely in Maggie's name, and that there's an offer that estate is sort of waiting for things to wrap up, but I think there's someone interested in buying the Moselle property. I don't know about the beach house, but potentially he's got enough assets that he wouldn't be entitled to a public defender. Although in general, if you are in jail, there is an assumption that you can't work and you don't have any means of support. Alec also inherited from Randolph when Randolph died. Randolph, his father, died. And he's actually entitled to inherit for Maggie. So I don't know at this point, but I would say he probably would not qualify for a public defender. Good question, though. Shirley P. When on the stand, Alec stated Maggie told him to leave when he was at the kennels, then quickly corrected himself and said that he decided to go to the house. Yeah, that was an interesting little slip. There are a couple of those places there where it kind of made you go, because he did say, when Maggie told me to leave. But I don't know whether, it's hard to say whether that was a slip of the tongue or whether that was Maggie told me to leave because I was hot and sweaty, or I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, but I don't know how much we can really draw from it. I definitely think that the comments about hurting the people he loved, I think you could definitely construe those as a certain consciousness of guilt. So Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I know we didn't nearly get through all your questions, so please drop your questions in the comments, and I will answer them. I answer every one. And or you can email me, info@theloriVallowstory.com, and drop me an email. I answer those as well. I usually get up in the morning and look through the comments with my coffee and try to answer as many questions as I can while they're still fresh in your mind and in mine. So please, if you have questions we didn't get answered tonight, please do that. I think there are going to be some interesting developments coming along in a couple of cases we're looking at. Oh, thank you for this is the link with the last newsletter, and the link to Brandy's timeline is in there if you're at all interested. I think we've got some interesting things potentially coming up in a couple of cases. We do have Brian Koberger, the University of Idaho case, coming up for preliminary hearing in June. There have been some interesting things going on in that case having to do with the gag order and the idea of whether or not you can gag the family members. There's been some dispute about that. The judge called the attorneys into a hearing, and she then clarified what her order was, and her order had to do with the lawyers commenting on the case to the media, and includes the lawyers for the family, but does not include the actual family members. So she clarified that. So that was kind of interesting. There were a couple of things that came up in Delphi. One was the potential of linking to a murder in the state of Kentucky. Not really sure whether that's going to come to anything or not, but I'll be keeping an eye on those things for you for next Wednesday when we're back together for True Crime Wednesday. And join me on Friday for all things Vallow Daybell, as we are getting closer and closer to trial, and the momentum is heating up in all of these motions. So hopefully we'll find out what's going on in tomorrow's hearing and be able to talk about that on Friday. So until then, have a great night. Thanks for joining me. I know that there's many other things you could be doing with your Wednesday night. So thanks for spending it with us. Good night.